I have always believed that certain sorts of weather lend themselves to legal proceedings. Rain, in particular, is almost litigious. It arrives with precedent and an appetite for records. It prefers to be seen doing its job, which is why when Ater unfurled a ledger that morning, with the sort of solemnity usually reserved for last wills, I could not entirely convince myself that we were ridiculous to be holding a trial beneath a tent that had already confessed a seam or two. The plan, as such things with any hope of working usually are, began with a joke and ended with paperwork. We would make a theatre of accusation, charge mirth as if it were an office misdemeanor, and call witnesses, whose testimony would be both comic and honest. The point was spectacle, because spectacle invites peculiar visitors, clerks, paper storms, the sorts of people who track laughter in the margins. If an institution could be baited by stagecraft, we would bait it till it tasted our particular brand of absurdity. Etta's lists lay across a battered trunk like maps with inked notations. She had numbered our grievances in tidy columns, counted but not given, unregistered belly laughs, misfiled consolations. Each entry was accompanied by a small star, her way of marking items she thought might prick at civic sensibilities. An auditor is only as good as his forms, she said, polishing the single lens of her spectacles until the brass seemed to consider admitting pity. If you give them a form they cannot ignore, they will come. They are bureaucratic woodpeckers. Bang enough and the wood will holler. Are we to be the wood? I asked. And the marlet, August replied, without looking up from his brass counter. He had stationed himself near the tent's seam to test the counter's click against the morning's hush. The counter fit his hand like a moral certainty, heavy, unbending, a small instrument meant to make difficult things seem countable. Nell will fly us open, Gus added, showing me a wooden witness box head fabricated with the affectionate disdain of a man who makes things because he can't afford to buy them. The box had a little door with a brass hinge and a circular window through which one could peer at a witness and at the faint hope in their eyes. Aerial testimony will be persuasive. People like to look up when they make judgments. Nell, who had been polishing her boots with the focus of someone practicing prayer, grinned. I will drop a truth or two from above and see what they land on. She practiced a step on the rope, and for a moment the tent was all lilt and possibility. Ropes pulling, canvas bowing, the sort of small miracle you have to time to a laugh. Marigold rehearsed in silence, her hands carving evidence from the air. I couldn't help but think of her as a court stenographer made of bone and mime. She wrote depositions in gestures, and when she was done, the corridor of the tent's backstage felt slightly fuller, as if someone had left the door unlocked to a cupboard of honest things. We advertised our trial with the sort of discretion a circus learns when it has nothing to sell but wonder. The notices were half-serious burnt paper pasted to lamp posts, invitations whispered through pastry shops, and a small poster Gus printed with a machine that coughed ink like a man with a secret. Charges against mirth, public hearing, it said in a type that tried to look both legal and comedic. The townspeople, who had more than their fill of dry Saturdays, accepted the invitation as if it had been offered with a wink. Curiosity is cheap when it comes with a bench to sit on. When evening came, we set the ring like jurors, a circle of crates, rope, and improvised dignity. August stood in the center at a small dais head fashioned from an upturned barrel. He had rigged a podium with his brass counter, as if to prove that applause could be transformed into evidence. Order, he intoned, in a voice that meant both business and stage voice. He tapped the counter, and the sound, tiny and metallic, landed on Knight's shoulders. The charges we drafted were purposely absurd, each one a condensation of an ordinary hurt. Count 1, failure to file a proper belly laugh. Count 2, unlicensed snort of delight in the presence of private sorrow. Count 3, neglect in returning a borrowed chuckle. We meant them all as satire, but satire is a net with holes large enough for consequences to seep through. by giving the town permission to laugh about the way we make work for ourselves. We also gave them permission to notice the thing that made us strange in the first place, an industry that turns consolation into commerce. Gus' props were competent farce. He had fashioned a gaveling device that puffed a modest cloud of flour at each pronouncement, the smell of bakeries, a necessary punctuation, and a mechanical clerk that would periodically rise under the arms of a large puppet to cuff out forms from its belly. The audience, a scattering of shopkeepers, children with wet hair, and people who had come to see whether a circus could be ridiculous with integrity, laughed at the mechanisms and at us. The laugh was the music we had come to sell, seconds of being unaccountable, then the quiet of consequence. It was a sound that both warmed and emptied me. When the show started properly, August read the first mock indictment with the theatrical solemnity of a man who measures applause at dawn. Merindrole, you stand accused of depleting laughter from the public commons and of making a profession of consolation while hoarding the capacity for mirth from your own chest. There was a pause, a legal silence, which in performance we had learned to stretch like taffy. I stepped forward, a defendant whose career had been built on making strangers forget their small despairs. I could feel the tense canvas listening, as if fabric held an opinion. "How do you plead?" August asked. I could have pleaded guilty to a dozen things: habit, neglect, the slow theft that gets called living. Instead I said, I pled performative. The audience laughed, an honest burst that warmed the tent the way hot porridge warms a hollow. I pled that I make people laugh because it keeps me useful. I pled that I do not hoard my own laugh intentionally. I pled that sometimes I envy the laughter I give away. Etta stood as our clerk and read from her ledger with a voice that was, as ever, a kind of weather forecast. She read testimonies, letters from townspeople we had comforted, and from those we had, inadvertently, humiliated. A man writes that his wife laughed, and he felt excluded. A child writes that when I chased his worry away, he found it again under his bed, as if it were a mislaid toy. Each line fell like a tiny rain, and the tense seam gave a small shiver. Marigold took the witness box in silence. She unpacked her evidence, not with words, but with gestures. She mimed a pocket where a laugh might have been carried, a slow handing over of a glove, the small exchange that counts for so much between one person and another. Watching her, you could see the audience slow, their expressions rounding into sympathy, as if sympathy were a rare animal they had been asked to feed for the night. Nell's testimony was physical. She came in on the wire, high and dangerous, and let a feather fall through the light. The feather landed on a magistrate's wig Gus had made out of straw. "We weigh risk in ways the ledger cannot," she said when she landed, her voice the sound of someone who trusts gravity and experience more than numbers. "Sometimes a laugh is the net beneath a failing act. Without it, people fall harder." The audience, who had watched her save a dropped banner at the market last week, inhaled with the memory of being saved. At the climax, we presented a tableau, a reenactment of the moment of whatever it was I had done to earn the curse, repainted as farce. We called a man from the audience to act the offended patron, and with his consent and a dram of theatrical license, staged the wrong laugh. The scene was small and terrible, a private sorrow met with the wrong tune. The man's face flashed angrily, then softened with the ridiculousness of being complicit in his own scandal. The audience laughed uneasily, and in that laugh I felt both exposure and the first stirrings of a reproach. You cannot merely document what was wrong without also acknowledging the small human missteps that made a law. We had turned an accident into a legal spectacle. Somewhere in the 5th or 6th round of dramatic flourishes and solemn accusations, the tense periphery grew a little crowded. At first I thought it was children drawn by the promise of something dramatic. Then I noticed the paper. It started as single sheets drifting in from the alley, thin municipal forms that quivered on the air's breath like pale moths. A clerk's ink scratch is a sound I have never been fond of, It is the sound of joy being given a number. But the sight of it arriving was, perversely, magnificent. The clerks came with the same lack of malice any bureaucrat has, paperwork in hand, hats damp with a drizzle that seemed to cross the threshold between weather and policy. They stood at the tent's edge, while the puppet clerk Gus had made cuffed out its little mechanical forms. Then, as if in mimicry, real forms lifted from their bundles and eddied around the tent like a curious flock. People turned their faces to them as if a wind had been offered them a new direction. The paper storm was absurd in the way only a civil service can be. Papers tumbled and sifted, and the noise was not wind but the soft, relentless whisper of registration. Forms were ticked, pens moved, the sound of ink on paper forming a brittle chorus. It is difficult to explain the sensation of being observed by a ledger. It is like being scanned by 1,000 silent clerks, whose pens perform their verdicts in shorthand. The tent seams trembled as if trying to read the margins. There was a moment, a single piano note of possibility, when I thought the auditor itself might step onto the canvas. Instead, we got a head of damp soot, grey as a forgotten morning, and the rustle of forms being exchanged in a language I recognized, regulation, annexed, codicil, and an editorial underlining that felt, for those brief seconds, like an accusation. August counted the incoming rustle with his brass counter. The clicks, each one an arithmetic of attention, sounded like a heartbeat to me. He stopped, then resumed, then paused as if considering whether applause could, in fact, be translated into something a ledger would accept. The brass felt cold in his hand. It was a little thing that made him look, for a moment, like a man who had discovered coins inside a Bible. "They always come if you give them paperwork," Etta murmured, half to herself. She had been watching the periphery with the concentrated gaze of a woman who reads rain not as a nuisance but as text. They cannot help it. It is what they are for. I thought of the jilted muse, of a joke that had been misapplied, and then elevated into law by repetition. There is a cruelty in systems that turn accidents into precedent. Worse, they then treat precedent as if it were a weather report. You are told to carry an umbrella against a storm that once was real until bureaucracy makes it permanent. People in the audience began to shift. The humor that had been warm and light had gained an edge, a question beneath the punchlines. We had achieved our immediate aim. The town had laughed. We had made a theater of our grievance, and civic record keepers, in their grey damp suits, had turned up their collars and their notebooks. The question remained whether our performance had been enough to make the auditor itself look up from its books. Backstage, after the final mock count and Gus Flower cloud gaveling, we huddled like conspirators who had just performed a necessary theft. We did not know whether we had stolen anything permanent. At best, we had borrowed notice. The tent smelled of flour and lamp oil and something more fragile and honest sort of exhaustion that seemed to have a value beyond any brass counter. Marigold mimed the scene we had enacted earlier, the private sorrow, the inappropriate laugh, her hands going through the motions of misplacement and then of restitution. Watching her, I realized that the mock trial had done something I had not expected. It had made people look at the small acts that make up law and mercy. We had, in our way, taught an audience that the difference between a joke and harm could be catalogued, and that the catalogue thing demanded a different sort of attention. Outside, by the lantern light, the paper storm thickened. Forms stuck to the tent like confessions pinned to a corkboard. The clerks were efficient, mechanical, patient as any force of governance. They did not howl or thunder. They simply did what they were for, which is to notice and to note. Their presence did not make me safer, nor did it make me more guilty. It made the situation legible. The canvas above our heads fluttered, as if someone were turning a page. August stood by the tent seam and, for the first time all day, allowed his hand to unclench from around the brass counter. He looked at the paper storm and then at us, and there was a private arithmetic in his face, risk versus the weight of obligation. "We have their attention," he said softly. The admission sounded both like triumph and like a new bill arriving on a doorstep. I slept that night with my pocket watch warm against my ribs. It told me jokes from my childhood, small, weathered things that smelled of pastry and damp rope. The tent settled its seams as if in thought, not yet healed but no longer certain it wanted to unravel. We had made a mockery into a summons, and the summons had been accepted in ink. There was, I knew then, an interval of waiting. We had provoked a force that records and preserves, and such a force does not respond with immediate flourish. It replies in registers and schedules, it checks its lists, it consults its margins, and it prepares its own performance. Perhaps it would come in a flourish, perhaps in a quiet footnote. Either way, the mock trial had done what it was meant to do. It had moved the problem out from our private backsides and onto a ledger that could be found. The tent seam, which had trembled all evening, gave a tiny sigh. It was the sound cloth makes when it considers mending. And in the distance, beyond the lamplight and the paper storm, a grey silhouette shifted where the rain met the street a line like a closed umbrella. An absence of face that felt very much like an observer who had just been given a table to sit at. We had set a pebble of performance into a pond of paperwork. The ripple had not yet revealed the shape of what would rise, but it had at least ensured that someone beyond our patchwork canvas had noticed that the water was moving. And when the tent finally stilled, with a hush like the holding of a breath before a verdict, I found that I could not remember whether I had been performing the mock trial in order to be seen or to see myself. Perhaps the difference is only a legalistic quibble. Either way, the morning would have questions to answer, and one of them larger than any brass counter, louder than any mock gavel, was this: when bureaucracy looks up from its books, will it recognize the thing it has been cataloging, or will it try to file the living under a new, colder name? The answer would, I understood with the peculiar clarity of someone who has spent his life trading on other people's lightness, arrive not as a trumpet but as a turn of page, slow, inevitable, and smelling of ink. We had drawn a line in the rain, and somewhere beyond, a ledger was being opened. The hook of that opening trembled like a fish on a line. I folded my hands and tried to think of jokes that were small and true, the sort you tell when you have nothing left to sell but yourself. Outside the tent, the forms continued to eddy like pale leaves. The night was listening, and the town had, for once, been made to look at itself in the margin. It felt, astonishingly, like a beginning. We had asked for attention and received it, and attention, like rain, is itself a form of currency. Whether it would pay our debts or invoice us for new ones hung, as things do in our profession, in a waiting room between performances. And then, in the last minute before sleep swallowed me, I heard the softest sound, someone turning a page. It was not thunder. It was not applause. It was a sound I had begun to fear and to hope for in equal measure. The tent listened with a patience I envied. It had held until now by ceremony and mending. Perhaps now it would be held by a page. We had performed a mock trial to summon a spectre of order, and the spectre had accepted our invitation to read. Somewhere in its reading, I thought, might be the place where a laugh could be reclaimed if only we could convince an institution that laughter is not merely something to be recorded, but also something that must be returned. The question remained open as the rain: would the auditor, when it finally arrived, be a man with a ledger or a law made of weather? The answer for now was a single, compelling thing. We had made it turn its first page. The rest, like a witness, would have to take the stand. At dawn, we took down the poster announcing our mock trial. The papers clung to the tent's outer seams, like a shame we could not brush off. The town had gone back to its routines. The clerks had gone back to their lists. But the ledger had a new entry, and that entry had our names near the top. We had been registered. The tent, if it did not yet mend, did at least feel less alone. And there, beneath the damp canvas, with flour on our hands and our theatre still clinging to the air, we waited for the next movement of the argument. The law, like a storm, was a slow thing, but we had started it, and in that starting there was, perversely and tenderly, hope. The hook pulled. The next page was being turned. We only had to be ready to speak when the auditor finally spoke back. I have always believed that the right performance at the right moment is the same sort of practical magic as asking a storm to behave. It is not coercion. It is choreography. You move your limbs and your lightness so that weather can be persuaded to show mercy, or at least make an agreeable scene of it. We had come to the mock trial like a people who knew a thing had teeth, but had forgotten which way to open the jaw. We told jokes the way one might tell a secret into a well, only louder. We arranged the stage with the exacting, domestic precision that August brings to everything he loves and fears. Lanterns in a row like little moons, chairs set in bureaucratic semicircles, a small table with a bell that belonged to some post office of dignity. August polished his brass counter until it sang its own soft cleanliness. Nell strung a line of bunting across the tent ceiling as if to pin the sky down. Etta placed her notebooks on the clerk's stand, each sheet a careful act of attention, like a person folding a letter to keep for a future hand. Marigold rehearsed silent witnesses with a kind of stern affection. Gus stationed his device near the back, a tangle of gears that hummed like an annoyed insect. Because even protesters like tools when those tools look like they used to belong to a carnival ride. Our charge sheets were absurd. We accused the auditor of artless theft, of hoarding laughter, of treating spontaneous joy as contraband. We faked indignation with the sincerity of people who have rehearsed their sorrow. We made signs and read complaints in Fox legalese. In the matter of unregistered mirth, the people v. no zero. It was the kind of thing the world had not expected from us. We looked like theatre students who had stumbled into a town hall and decided to stay the night. The audience, townsfolk, children, the bewildered baker who had baked nuts for reasons she later called optimism, arrived with umbrellas and curiosity, and therefore our trial had the right atmosphere, half court, half carnival, and wholly vulnerable. We began the way a trial ought to begin, with pageantry that respected both law and silliness. August declaimed the docket with the precise melodrama of a man who measures applause by the grain. "We present evidence," he announced, tapping the bell as if to summon the rain's own conscience. "We call the witness of the weather." He had learned, in the long careful evenings when the tent stitched itself by apologetic puddles, that ceremony is the only language with the bandwidth to hold meaning when things might dissolve. I performed first, as if the universe might prefer to be pleaded with through a pratfall. There is a particular geometry to pratfalls, an angle that takes you from dignity to farce without breaking the spine of the thing that follows, and I took it like a man who has practiced humility until it fits his bones. The audience recognized the movement. They allowed themselves the small kindness of laughing. That laugh felt like a coin placed into a glass jar with the label "Not Mine." It jingled, it was honest, and then it was seen. No, Zero did not arrive with drums or fanfare. It came the way the weather does when it is trying to be official, quiet but thorough. The tent lost 2 decibels of warmth, as if someone had respectfully dimmed all the lamps. Clerks drifted in from the seams. They were the paper storms we had read about in Etta's List's grey coats, ink-smudged fingers, the smell of ledger dust and damp. They walked with a practiced economy, the way people who are all tools of a single aim move. The air tasted like a ledger's page. Then no. Zur itself stepped from the smallest shadow at the back of the tent. Imagine a suit that has been rained on its whole life and took to wearing the melancholy like an accessory. Umbrella closed, like a fist that might never open for a smile. The face was nothing, the sort of nothing that has been practiced into 1,000 bureaucratic stares. The thing's presence felt at once theatrical and deeply, administratively final. It did not speak in the florid tongues of villainy. It spoke in the tone of policy. Citation, its voice announced, which is to say it sounded exactly as a piano sounds in a place where pianos are catalogued. The clerks folded their hands and presented the ledger, an odd object stitched of cloud and order, its pages breathing faintly as if it contained weathered affidavits. August's hands stilled on the counter. The brass took on a small tremor, like a wrist that is nervous in the face of authority. The audience stilled too, the way water stills when a stone hovers above it. We had hoped the mock trial would draw attention. We had not hoped to be the attention's lunch. No. Zul read, which is not quite the same thing as listening. Reading is an activity that reduces things to lines. Listening is the messy job of holding music in your lap and learning to be surprised. It read our jokes as if they were receipts. This performance, no. Zhu declared, turning the ledger as if the wind inside it had documents to submit, bears evidence of unauthorized mirth. Clause 4. 2. Spontaneous reverie without permissive registration. Subclause B. Laughs of non-compliant origin we must quantify. Its clerks took out instruments that were half quill and half pincushion and began to mark. When it pronounced unregistered, a seam in the canvas above us shuddered, and when the shudder settled we found that a thread had become a ribbon and had dropped into the sopping earth. The act was small as a pinprick but enormous in consequence. The tent is not territory, it is a habit. When habits unravel, the people who live inside them feel as if their own moral garments are loosening. I should have been furious. I am practiced in righteous indignation. It is a commodity among clowns, second only to timing. Instead, I felt naked and anatomically foolish, as if someone had rid my laugh as an unpaid invoice and made me stand for audit in the post office of ridicule. There is a particular sting to being told that your joy is a liability. It is a kind of humiliation that tastes like wet cotton. But I am a clown first and a man of embarrassment second, and embarrassment is a fuel when you know how to harness it. I tried to make a joke. It was not the time-honored pratfall this time, but a small, self-aware observation about the auditor's umbrella, lovely umbrella. Is it certified for drizzle or full municipal sorrow? The laugh that followed was polite and brittle. No. Zhu's clerks measured it with a clinical patience. They made calculations with the kind of concentration you reserve for stitches and wills. Unregistered. No, Zhou said again. Its voice did not rise or fall. It applied itself. Another seam released itself like a sigh and let down another ribbon of canvas into the mud. The tent's red and white stripes looked less like paint and more like the memory of paint. They were beginning to assume the color of regret. Etta nudged me, her spectacles fogged with a sympathy that has the same slow bloom as tea. They treat laughter as a line item, she whispered, in the tone of someone who folds sorrow into lists, because lists are the only places that will keep them from getting lost. But a line item is a thing that can be balanced. Life is not. Her fingers were steady on the ledger stand. She had bookmarked a page labeled Past Consolations. Finally, and with a compassion I had not expected from a thing built to be impartial, no, Zhu consented to allow testimony. This is where the absurdity of the law meets the earnestness of performance, and where of course we had chosen to live. I climbed the witness box, which was a stack of flattened crate lids and a confidence that had been made over 1,000 small humiliations. The clerks leaned forward as if to better catch an argument. Their presence made the air taste like the belly of a filing cabinet. I felt the familiar trappings of comic ritual. The white paint on my face, like a map of where I had been brave, and the pocket watch in my vest that told past jokes instead of time. The watch ticked with a small, patient click that had nothing to do with minutes and everything to do with memory. State your name for the record. No, Zhu intoned. Merendrol, I said. My voice sounded like the one you use when reading aloud to a sleeping child flat, with the attempt not to wake anything you want to keep. Occupation, it continued, clown, repairer of torn seams, cataloguer of open mouths. It had become habit for me to describe myself with the precision of a person listing a vocation and a confession. The ledger made small notations. Why? No. Zure asked, and the single syllable was a lever. Did you laugh at the sorrow of another? It was a precise question, the sort you can only answer badly, and then be obliged to live with the consequence. I could have invoked rain lore and jilted muses and patrons who mistake exposure for attendance. I could have said that the world often mistakes the laughter born from shock for cruelty, which is true. I could have said that I misread the situation because I was young and thought improvisation a kindness. In the end, none of the reasons matter. Reasons are like umbrellas. They keep off the obvious rain for a minute and then fold up uselessly. The town needs the truth more than the category of a reason, so I told the truth. I told the story of a night with a man who had been weeping behind the curtain, a private sorrow misinterpreted by a man eager to impress, and how my laugh, sharp and unchecked, had landed where a shoulder might have been. I told it without costume softening. I told the chronology of my own shame as if it were a recipe, and if the kitchen was a place of mistakes, then this was mine. The clerks marked the ledger. Nozo made a small notation that looked like a comma and a reprimand. The tent gave up another thread and the mud took it as if to say, we shall keep this now. I expected the world to judge me, and it did in its inexorable administrative way. But the world is not a single mind, it is a chorus. In the middle of my confession a sound rose that was not the ledger and not the clerks. It was tentative at first, like a timid bird testing a new temperature. Someone laughed. It was not the brittle, polite laugh of earlier. It was a laugh that came from where people keep their breath for what is tender and exacting. It was not mockery and it was not relief. It was recognition. Theo, a small boy with a face like a found coin, had remembered a ridiculous image I had described, not of me, but of the absurdity of my mistake. And he laughed in a way that was larger than innocence and smaller than theology. The laugh passed through the tent like a current. Nozer listened as if that single laugh had violated a protocol. On its ledger, a small ink blot appeared as if the cloud had been startled. The clerks hesitated, their hands intermediate between instruments and gestures. For a moment the tent held its breath, and then, to everyone's astonishment, some people began to laugh who had not before. The baker, whose hands were always flour-scented and who had come because August had promised a spectacle, laughed in a way that sounded like breaking open a crust of sorrow and finding jam. Marigold, who rarely made a sound, made a small exhalation that was practically a syllable and then mimed a laugh that was exaggerated and therefore honest. No. Zero moved its ledger as if to mark the moment into categories. This instance is, it began, and the word it would choose would determine whether another seam would fall. The tent trembled like a patient listening to a verdict. I realized then, along with the audience, and perhaps even along with the clerks, that the act of confessional sizing up I had undertaken was not merely about me. It was a demonstration. Here was the thing the ledger could not reconcile, laughter that arrived from an acknowledged shame, offered not as a shield but as a hand. The system was designed to count and classify. It did not contain a box for shared vulnerability. For the first time since the tent began to dissolve, no. Zor performed an unpredictable gesture. It paused. In that pause the ledger inhaled. Pending review, it said finally, which is to say it had found neither a category nor a comfort. The clerks murmured and shuffled. The seam that might have dropped stayed, and the tent seemed, for a moment, to consider itself. The audience exhaled as a single, small brass chorus. A child clapped in delighted astonishment. August let his brass counter slide a fraction of an inch into the dust. Etta put her hand over a page in her notebook, as if to hide it, and when she looked back at me, there was an expression that read, "We can work with this." Nell tugged her ribbon tight as if to say, "Do not let this become more dangerous than it must." Gus pretended to attend to a bolt, but his eyes were on the tent, as if he could invent a solution out of patience and grease. No, looked at me. If its face had been a face, we would have called that look sympathy. Because it had no face, it was something like administrative curiosity. You confess to the misapplication of laughter, it said. You admit to an improper allocation. Why should the ledger return what has been classified to your property? There are questions you cannot answer with wit. I was trained to answer many of them. I had prepared routines that could soothe a grievous village, but now I was called upon to make an argument that was not a gag. I could have asked for pity. I could have offered to pay restitution in kind, the way August loves, in measures and ledgers and numbers. But ledgers are what had brought us here. I needed to find a way to speak in a currency the ledger could not yet comprehend. So I told a story. I told them of the way laughter moves like a draft under a door. Once it is out, it belongs to the room. The room can be generous or miserly with it, but the air itself remembers where the warmth came from. I described how, when I made a man laugh in the wrong place, the laugh didn't need to be owned by me so much as acknowledged by us as a hideous and salvageable thing that we could say, together, we are all ridiculous once in a while, and that does not reduce your sorrow. I said it without theatricality. I said it like a man who had apologized to puddles and knew their language. No, did not laugh. Clerks do not. But it looked at the ledger as a person looks at a child who has been given a toy it does not understand how to play. Audit will proceed, it said finally. We shall determine ownership of shared mirth. Until conclusion, restrictions apply. Restrictions? August asked, his voice the sound of a man used to negotiating in degrees. Temporary limitation on unregistered performance, the auditor said. Permits required for the spontaneous deployment of laughter during public assembly. Fines may apply if unregistered mirth persists. At the word fines, a small murmur cut through the audience like a cold wind. You do not need to be poor to understand the grammar of fines. They are polite threats the economy wears when it wishes to be cruel. I wanted to protest that the idea of licensing laughter was monstrous. I wanted to produce an theatric retort, a juggling of brass counters, a cascade of buttons, a pratfall into the ledger itself. I wanted, however, more desperately, to keep the tent whole. Each time an unregistered is pronounced, another seam disappears. Our existence was counted in thread. August's ledger counted dollars. No, Z's ledger counted echoes. Both were hungry in different ways. So we negotiated in the private language of performers, asking for the indulgence of wildness. August argued with the gentle logic of a man who cannot let his responsibilities be simplified. Etta offered to supply logs of storms as mitigating evidence. Nell proposed a dangerous but precise aerial offering to the auditor, a tightrope demonstration that would be a form of goodwill, a visible risk borne in public for the sake of art. Gus offered to modify his contraption to transmit, not count, laughter, an idea that made Marigold's lips taste against a smile. The clerks scribbled notes. No. Zor recorded each offer with a calmness that suggested it had been taking similar offers for some time and had never been moved. I heard someone in the second row, a woman who sold umbrellas and had a laugh like a spoon, say softly, "They want to privatize the weather of the heart." That is not a sentence people say often. It is an accusation made by someone who deals in coverings. The tent's fabric, suddenly, felt as if it had an opinion. In the end, no. Zur agreed to an interim, a stay on the most punitive measures in return for a provisional registry, and the appointment of a mediator. Of course, the mediator would be an impartial person appointed by a ledger. That, I believe, is the point at which bureaucracy becomes a plot device. We left with a list of stipulations and a sense that we had not entirely lost the world to counting. The tent had lost more ribbon, but it had not collapsed. The evening that followed was not celebratory. It was a kind of tired relief, like a person who has narrowly escaped rain with only slightly soggy shoes. We moved inwards then, away from the eyes with behavior that was half private repair and half communal grace. Gus worked on gears with a new precision, as if he were unpicking the logic of the ledger and suing an alternative. Nell drank black tea and told young performers how to fall and how to rise. Etta made a list of the things we would need to register, and under each item she wrote in a column of soft pencil, "Truth." The baker made hot bread that tasted like apology. Marigold found me in the dim, where props were kept, the space where jokes go to sleep when they are honest. She mimed a hand holding a small object and then opening it. Inside was something invisible and light. She then tapped her temple and gestured at my painted mouth. We worked in silence until she made the universal mime gesture for return, and then the gesture for give. She was asking me, in the only language that sometimes says more than speech, if I could give what I had asked to get. I had wanted my laugh back as if it were a thing that could be reclaimed whole. The lecture of the ledger and the cold face of no. Zoo had shown me the other angle, that to ask for the thing is to prepare to give. Marigold's pantomime was kinder than policy. "You cannot bribe the world into repair," she wrote on her face with a movement. "You can only hold out your hands and wait to be trusted with a laugh again." I left the tent that night with the tent less whole than when we had begun, but with an odd lightness. There was a new kind of work ahead, papers to be filed, conciliations to be proposed, performances to be registered with enough honesty that the ledger had no comfortable way to swallow them. The auditor had not been defeated. It had been engaged. The danger remained. We had bought time with confessions, with promises, with the thin human economy of apologies and small reparations. As I walked through the puddled alley toward the caravan that housed my illusions and my socks, the watch in my pocket ticked and recounting jokes like a faithful, useless metronome. The rain smelt like a neighbor's letter, damp and intimate. Above, where the canvas had once been seamless, a small star of the tent's red had become less and less until it was simply memory. We would mend it. We would mend ourselves. But the ledger had taught me a practical lesson. Scarcity looks good on a budget. It makes people count what they have. Counting makes people careful. Careful people sometimes become small. I do not suppose no. Zor will change its habits overnight. Institutions do not have the luxury of epiphany. They have the script of policy. But there was something in the pause it took when Theo laughed that suggested even ledger dust can be surprised. If an accounting of joy could be paused, perhaps it could be negotiated. If it could be negotiated, perhaps it could be shared. And I, who had come to this ridiculous career because the world needed someone to fall and stand again with good timing, found my task altered. It was no longer merely to get my laugh back. It was to teach other people to measure their laughter, not by what they could keep, but by what they could trust each other to hold. I had a plan that was as foolish as any good plan, to give a laugh away until I had learned its economy well enough to ask for mine. The ledger would need to be shown that laughter, properly handed, returned differently. It would become, in the best-case scenario, inconvenient for the auditor to keep hoarding that which people freely offered one another. We would need to ask the towns to help. We would need to confess small cruelties in public and be made ridiculous. We would need to risk more seams. I do not pretend the strategy had elegance. It had only commitment, and clowns have always been better at the latter. As I closed the caravan door behind me, the tent sighed somewhere like a creature relieved to be listening. The hook of the chapter was not an ending but a choice. The choice to be stripped down and honest in public, to make humiliation a vehicle for repair. The ledger would not like that. No, Zero would prefer the neatness of boxes. We would prefer to be messy and glorious. In the morning we would begin gathering evidence in a different way, not as proof for a ledger, but as stories for one another. We would take the ridicule and make it into a ritual that taught towns how to return their own weather. I lay awake thinking of how vulnerability can sound when it is shared, less like a solitary laugh. more like a chorus that remembers to include the people who have been left out. Outside, the rain ran politely off the caravan roof. Somewhere in the tent a thread quivered, and then it was quiet enough to hear the watch tick telling jokes as if time itself kept its secrets in laughter. We had not won, we had not even necessarily survived, but we had summoned attention to the exact thing that feeds us and starves us. That was the sort of invitation clowns know how to accept. And so, with the ink of the ledger trailing in my thoughts like a contrail, I slept and dreamt of no. Zoo pausing and finding an empty box labeled, "Permission to be ridiculous." It is a hopeful dream because dreams can be. The next day would be when we tried to fill it.